All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much to those of you who are joining us today for Abundant Housing LA's Housing 101. My name is Luke Klipp, and I am the Education Director on the Abundant Housing LA Steering Committee. And the presentation I'm about to give you today, Housing 101, is a product of my own creation, but with a lot of guidance and support and direction from the whole team at Abundant Housing LA. Also joining us here on the call today is Esteban Garcia, who is, Esteban, you want to do a quick introduction to yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody, I'm Esteban. I've written the emails that you've probably seen about this or the social media posts. I am Abundant Housing LA's communications manager, and I'll be here to handle questions. So you should have the Q&A function available for you. And so toward the end of the meeting, we'll open up for questions, and I will be managing that. So you'll hear from me again toward the end.
Thank you, Esteban. We're going to dive right in. That we've got from 12 to 2 on the agenda, on the schedule here. If we end a little sooner than that, great. But please feel free to if you need to step out at any point to do so. This is all just on your time. It's all something that we just want to offer to help have folks here understand a little bit more about our housing history in Los Angeles and how that shapes our present. So I'm just going to share my screen here to just dive right in. All right. Can you see that, Esteban?
Yep.
Great. So for starters, this is a Housing 101. This is a primer Housing LA, because that is a very complicated and long and sordid history. There are many things that will come up here that we could do a deeper dive into. And frankly, that if I had a little more time as a volunteer, I think things to help inform us. But frankly, that doesn't mean that we can't stop at any moment if you have some. But if there are really pressing questions you have that come up along the way that you really want to just take a moment, please feel free to ask questions along the way. I appreciate hearing from folks and getting a sense of sort of what are the key issues that you're concerned with, and how those things come about in our presentation here, how you sort of things that you're picking up on that you're keying into as we go through this today. As I mentioned, I'm here as a volunteer. My day job's actually in local politics for a number of years, including several on my local neighborhood council, where I also served as president. So I've seen a lot of these sort of how housing challenges, housing fights sort of play out at a local level through a number of venues. And I'm happy to sort of speak to that from personal experience, but really this is to sort of help us understand our housing history through the lens of things that we know happened over the last 100 years, that we can see through data, that we can see through our historical documentation, as well as how those things are playing out today. We have an agenda, and let me get this to work. There we go. This is what we're going to run through here. We're mostly today going to spend time on looking at housing history and how our history shapes our present. But then we are going to talk a little bit about sort of our overall theory of change at Abundant Housing LA, sort of what are the key things that we think are important to addressing our housing crisis, and some specific policy approaches that we recommend. And we'll wrap up at the end with some ways that you can get involved as you would like to with Abundant Housing LA. So this is St. Joe's Hospital in Superior, Wisconsin, which is on the northwestern edge of the state of Wisconsin, at the western tip of Lake Superior. I share this because the hospital was built in the 30s, shuttered in the 70s. I lived in this hospital as a kid for a few years when it was an abandoned hospital. And I share this story because as a white person, I have a great deal of privilege in our context of our housing conversation, as we will see very clearly over this presentation. But also, I think it's important to recognize that for many of us, housing is a very personal thing. There are moments in our lives that may be very short, that may be very long, where many of us have experienced housing insecurity. And it's important that we sort of recognize and acknowledge that is the case for many of us, that this is a very personal thing. Housing is, we can talk about it in sort of data driven and sort of academic ways. But this is having a roof over your head. This is the ability to go to sleep at night and feel safe and comfortable. These are very, very personal things. It's a very personal topic. And I just want to make sure that we're clear that as much as we can look at the data and as much as we can look at the numbers and, sort of the policies and all that, that for each one of us, this is really rooted in something very personal and very important. So with that said, I think it's also important to recognize that for many of us, we come to this conversation in this moment because finding a place to live in LA is kind of like the Hunger Games. It's a little ridiculous. Housing prices are astronomical. We should recognize that it's not just in LA, but certainly we are one of the most unaffordable places to live anywhere in the country. So I want to just open here with a little a video of something that has sort of circulated on social media the last couple days that someone took outside Country Club Park. And I want to note there's some strong language in the video. So if that's an issue for you, feel free to put your computer on mute. It's only a minute long. You can see most of the text because she's also annotated this in her presentation. And I need to, let's see here. I need to put this on screen share. There we go. Okay.
Y'all want to see the wealth gap in LA? Let me show you. I have to walk down this street in order to catch a bus, right? However, there's a gate blocking this entire fucking street. That's where a lot of more wealthy individuals live, right? Like, I can't even get through the gate, mind you. Both Google, City Mapper, every navigation app is telling me to go down this street in order to get to my bus, but I can't. You know why? Because the gate's locked because once again, wealthy individuals fucking zoning the area. And that the wealth gap with yours truly. Oh, and I'm about to miss my bus because I have to walk all the way fucking around to get to a bus with a stupid ass gate. And now as you can see, I'm still walking down. There's still more gates. So I have to go all the way to a bigger street to get to where I need to go. Waste my time.
So that is Country Club Park, where that individual was walking. Country Club Park, it was mapped in the redlining era, which we'll talk about a little bit, as described at that of the 1930s, that the minimum size of the single-family dwellings protected against what they described as racial hazards, and that was also responsible for. These were descriptors that were used by official government maps at that time about that location, about that neighborhood, as reasons that it was a high-quality area for the federal government to support homeowner loans in that community. That Country Club Park neighborhood was designated as and in that designation, they cited that it matured in the 1920s, which we'll find out shortly was a time when we had deed restrictions on single-family zoning all across the country, and especially here in Los Angeles, which limited home ownership opportunities to white people. But the city council noted that the maturing of that community in the 20s was an important reason for its designation as historic. They also cited the proximity of that location, that community, to the original Pico Boulevard streetcar as one of the reasons it was historic. And I just note that because, as you can see from those gates, you can't actually get to Pico Boulevard because that individual, she was walking on Pico Boulevard and she couldn't actually get into Country Club Park or through Country Club Park because of the gates along Pico Boulevard. The only other thing I would just note about that historic designation is that the only detriment that they cited in their designation, or one of the key detriments they cited to designated as historic, was that there's been some infill development. In other words, there had been in the intervening years since it was first built in the 1920s. So I just share that because I think that's an important, it gives us a little bit of context here for where we're going. So just said a lot of things that are going to be, we're going to dive a little more into here. But I think it's important first to just note there are two central ideas to this presentation today. One is that single family zoning leads to a lot of the challenges we see today in our housing crisis. They leads to unaffordable rents for just about all of us, and actually ties into homelessness. 3/4 of the land that we've zoned for residential uses in the city of LA are single family zoning only, and that houses only 1/3 of our population. I'm just going to repeat that. 5% of all of the city of LA houses 1/3 of our population. So that means the other 2/3 of our population gets the remaining quarter, the remaining 25% of our residentially zoned land. And that's because single family zoning takes up a lot of space for not very many people. The other thing that is a key central idea here, which we're going to this is going to come up slide after slide. Housing today is systemically racist and has been for a very, very long time. I think that's important to make a clarification here. Systemic racism is not the same thing as an individual being a racist or an individual policy being racist. That systemically housing is racist. Now, there may be individuals, there may be individual policies that are racist within that. But this is to say that the way our system of housing works, it inherently is racist. It inherently disadvantages people who are Black and brown over people who are white, and it has done so for over a century. So it's important, but I want to make that distinction because I think sometimes when we have this conversation around racism in housing, people say, oh, well, you know, this homeowner, they're racist for opposing this apartment building. Well, they may or may not be racist themselves, but opposing the opportunity for people with less means to be able to have housing in a desirable community is part of the issue with systemic racism. That is part and parcel with systemic racism. So I think it's important for us to sort of tease out systemic racism is the issue here, and that is fed into by people who are racist and racist policies, but that does not mean that every person or every policy that is part of our housing conversation is therefore racist. So this is an important timeline that there's a lot of stuff on one slide, but we're really going to dive into each one of these things. I shouldn't say dive in. We're going to really sort of touch on all, but I want to just sort of tease this thing out a little bit more. I want to sort of pull out like this history and how this plays into where we are today. So the first thing on the timeline over here in 1917 is Buchanan v. Worley. That is a U.S. Supreme Court decision that banned explicit zoning on the basis of race. So it was which was doing something that many cities were doing at the time, where they had zoning laws that said, if you are a white person, you can't buy or rent a home in a primarily Black community. And if you're a Black person, you can't buy a primarily white community. This is something, again, a number of cities were starting to do at this time. And the Supreme Court said, no, 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 you can't do that. Well, what did we do instead? We created deed restrictions. And deed restrictions, I've indicated sort of with this brown line here, when they were really very much at the fore in determining who had access to housing and who did not. You'll notice the brown line ends at 1948 with Shelley v. Kramer, which was another decision, another court decision, which rendered race-based deed restrictions unenforceable by the courts. So the courts finally said, we do not find that deed restrictions can be enforced through the judicial process. That doesn't mean that the deed restrictions went away. It just means they were no longer enforceable. Deed restrictions on single-family homes all across Los Angeles today. There have been asks at the state level in the past to remove deed restrictions or to comb through and get rid of them, even at the county level. But the work that would be involved, because they're tied to every single individual house, is extraordinary. And there's been a lot of pushback from the administrative side of just the amount of cost and time and effort it would require to comb through and eliminate deed restrictions. But many of the homes that exist in LA today still have deed restrictions that forbid reselling your home to someone who is not white, or in some cases to someone who is not Christian, because we also had deed restrictions on the basis of faith. But that said, deed restrictions from 1917 to 1948. In 1921, LA was one of the very first cities in the country to adopt single-family zoning, which when you think about it today is quite remarkable that the vast majority of our land in the city is now committed to a zoning type that we just created a century ago. The city's been around for a few hundred years, but we only 100 years ago adopted a zoning type that we have now since covered our entire city with. But we created single-family zones, which single-family zoning was very much was tied in with this deed restrictions of white only, and not always, but often Christian only home ownership. That will let through the 1920s, we get to 1929, 39 with the Great Depression. In the midst of the Great Depression, the federal government says, as part of the New Deal, that one of the best ways that we can create wealth building within the country is home ownership. And up until this National Housing Act of 1934, the federal government didn't get involved with supporting financing of home ownership the way it did once we had the familiar with home ownership, are familiar with the idea of the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. That was the gold standard that was established as part of this effort in the mid-30s to create home ownership opportunities across the country, where the federal government said, we will back mortgages that will make home ownership affordable. Because if you think about it as a lender, as a bank, what are the incentives to a private bank to lend money to someone on the basis of income that they may or may not have for the next 30 years? It's unheard of. Home ownership was just incredibly out of reach at the time, because it was near impossible to get a mortgage that would truly make the home ownership affordable. When you spread out your payments over 30 years, it's much more affordable to own a home than if you have to pay for it in 5 or 10 years. So the federal government, in backing this particular type of a financing tool, was saying, we want home ownership to be the way that people create wealth. And it worked. It worked as intended. And unfortunately, it worked as intended in some ways, very much so. Because as you see here, I've indicated with a red line, the red line is for the era of redlining. Because as part of the federal government saying, we're going to go ahead and back home ownership mortgages, home loans, we also want to minimize our risk. And while banks would minimize risk by looking at all things like your income, job stability, et cetera, and they would also look at race, the federal government almost explicitly made race its standard policy in redlining. They put out a call for maps that were created through the Homeowners Loan Corporation that went into play in 1936. They became part of the approach that the federal government took. And those maps color-coded communities all across the country. And they took neighborhoods and they assigned them a color, either a green, a blue, a yellow, or a red. We'll get into this in a little bit. But based on that color, you would be more or less likely to be able to qualify for a federally backed mortgage. That were colored green and blue on those maps were almost exclusively white communities, and the areas colored yellow and especially red were not. So that by the time that redlining was outlawed explicitly in the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which is where the red line ends here, over 98% of federally backed mortgages were to white households, 98%. So that policy worked as intended, which was to make home ownership a reality for white homeowners. I've also noted here in 1937, the federal public housing construction starting. The federal government said, okay, well, home ownership isn't a possibility for everyone. Let's provide public housing. For those of you who come to this as from an approach of public housing in my backyard, or FIMBY, we did this. starting in the late 1930s with federal government support, created a lot of federal. We functionally stopped doing that in 1950 with California Article 34, which 1950 by the California Association of Realtors, which required that any publicly financed housing would require a vote of support from the voters of the city in which that housing would be built. And this was intentionally done to stop the construction of new publicly financed housing. California Article 34 is still the law of the land, although it is now up for a vote on the state ballot in this November. But it has been the law of the land for the last housing has to get a vote in support by the voters. Now, there have been ways cities have worked within this rubric over the last number of decades to sort of ease the constraints that it places on them. At the same time, even though they've done that, this one particular measure, and I want to say the last I saw was somewhere between $5,000 and $20,000 per unit of affordable housing to be built in California today because of this measure. 1956 was the Federal Highway Act. Now, we were building highways before that, but 1956 basically threw gasoline on the fire, where the federal government said, we'll back every dollar you spend to construct a highway with $9 federal dollars. So local governments were heavily incentivized in large quantities, and we did, and we'll see some of the impact of that shortly. 1964, the state of California voters approved Proposition 14, which we'll talk about in a little bit. I'm just noting it on the timeline here because it is a significant moment for us in California. 1970, Governor Ronald Reagan signed into law the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, which has ended up being one of the biggest legislative mechanisms to oppose infill has been the case. Not coincidentally, in 1973, the federal government stopped construction of public housing. Now, I want to note a little bit about our federal public housing because I talked a little about PHMB and the California Article 34. But when the federal government was constructing public housing starting in the late 1930s, it was segregated. It was segregated public housing. And with a subsequent federal housing bill, National Housing Bill in 1949, there was an effort by Republicans to kill the bill, where they would insert an amendment, what's called a poison pill, that would make it something that none of the Democrats wanted to support, where they wanted to put in an amendment that said, you have to desegregate federally funded public housing. And they knew this was an idea that was popular with some of the more progressive Democrats, but very unpopular with the Southern Democrats, and they wanted to split Democrats on this to kill the federal public housing bill in 1949. They were unsuccessful in that effort. However, by virtue of being unsuccessful, segregation in public housing remained the case for years to go. So, however, with the Fair Housing Act of 1968, it became illegal to discriminate on the basis of race in housing accommodation. Surprisingly, just a few years later, the federal government got out of the business of constructing public housing. A few years after that, in 1978, one of the most successful measures in transferring wealth from renters to longtime homeowners. 1979, the city of LA approved historic preservation overlay zones as a new mechanism, or HPOZs as a new mechanism to preserve existing communities on the basis of their historic importance. I mentioned earlier Country Club Park, and we'll talk a little bit later about what HPOZs mean for communities. In 1986, LA city voters approved Proposition U, which you've probably never heard of. But Proposition U downzoned all of our boulevards across the entire city of LA. It was supported by a number of folks who are still out and about today opposing new housing. Downzoned all of our corridors. So I like to call sort of the strip mall act We have a lot of strip malls along our major streets here in the city of LA, and you know, in many cases, they're quite popular. They get some really nice restaurants, really cool little shops in them. At the same time, they make a lot of our streets really unwalkable because the parking is in front, and there's very few trees. But there's also not a lot of dense housing along our corridors, which are the most heavily served by transit, are the most walkable in general throughout our city. That's the result of Proposition U, which is still the law of the land today. I also indicated in the timeline here a yellow bar. This is a period of time for this. And I think it's really important to note this, and I'll talk a little bit more about downzoning in a little bit. But most of the housing in our older communities that exist today, I live in Los Feliz, where over 2/3 of the existing housing, you could not build under the existing zoning code because it was built prior to this period of downzoning, this 40 years of downzoning, which basically made most of the housing in our older communities throughout the city illegal. So if it was to burn down or fall down or whatever, you could not rebuild what is there today. And note the subprime mortgage debacle, as I'll call it here. It was a period in the early aughts when there was very aggressive lending practices where banks were preying on folks who were particularly, they were preying on Black and brown households to offer home ownership opportunities through where they hid the terms of those mortgages, and then led to a massive amount of bankruptcies that precipitated the 2008 financial crisis of 2008. All of that said, 2016 was the very first time in over a century, basically probably ever, that the city of LA voters approved an upzoning. It approved more space for housing in the city through Measure JJJ, which is now today known as the Transit Oriented Communities Incentives, or TOC. That is now responsible for thousands of getting built, have first time the city of LA voters ever approved a measure to increase density in our city. So don't worry, we're going to sort of touch on all of these things now one by one. So the timeline starts. LA makes this designation of single family zoning. And for the city of LA, we see a massive amount in early construction of new housing. You'll see here from the early 20s into the mid 20s, we see in 1 year, actually 1923, 44,000 new homes got built in a single year. For comparison, today, we're averaging over the last decade about 10,000 new homes a year. So LA was seeing a lot more housing getting built a century ago than we are today, at a time when the city was a much smaller population. So proportionally, seeing somewhere between 10 and 15 times as much housing getting built in the city right now. The other thing I note on this chart, I put a red bar here. That's the period when redlining started. And you'll see that even though housing starts to jump up again as we emerge from the Great Depression, it's substantially more composed of single-family homes. Whereas here, you had a lot more multifamily. Here you have a lot less. It's a lot more single-family. Systemic racism, this is the housing policies working as intended, which is with the federal government saying, we're going to go ahead and back mortgages to incentivize single-family home ownership. And we'll see in a little bit, white homeowners. I mentioned deed restrictions. So deed restrictions came about, were in existence before we had redlining. Deed restrictions were used to limit, when you bought a home in a new community, like you've seen a Hollywood, it was an advertisement for this community here. And it was intended to attract people to go out there to see what the homes were like, because they were mostly living in central LA. And you'll see this brochure for Hollywoodland notes that you can protect your family by procuring at today's prices a home place in the hills of Hollywoodland, secured by fixed and natural restrictions against the inroads of metropolitanism. Now, that may all seem kind of flowery language, but fixed and natural restrictions against the inroads of metropolitanism is a lot of euphemisms for you're not going to be in the city, and it's not going to be city folk. The folks here in Eagle Rock with their brochure were a little bit more explicit about it, where they said the residents of Eagle Rock are all of the white or Caucasian race. Now, those of you who live in Eagle Rock today know that that is not the case in Eagle Rock in 2020, but this was the case in Eagle Rock in 1920. This was the case in Hollywoodland. This was the case in many of our single family communities across Los Angeles, where they were being built in the 20s, in the 30s. Communities that we now today take for granted as old, established single family communities were brand new at this time, but they were only available to white people to purchase homes. We're going to get into redlining. This is the redlining map for central Los Angeles. This came out in the mid 1930s. If you're familiar, if you work well with maps, you already picked up where everything is in here. But this is downtown LA here. This is Mid Wilshire here. This is Hollywood. This is Beverly Hills. This is Santa Monica, Culver City down here, South Central LA. And then up where I live, Los Feliz, Silver Lake, and Atwater and Glendale. And this is Boyle Heights over here. So you'll see pretty quickly these colors stand out. And the green is fairly limited, mostly to communities that are on the hills. The blue, there's some blue here in a lot of blue in Mid Wilshire and Hancock Park area. And then yellows and reds basically dominate central LA, except for Silver Lake, Los Feliz, and portions here down in South LA. So it's pretty clear there's some distinct coloring here, and what is this? And so now we have to ask, okay, what does this mean? So I've pulled up, you can actually find the documents that describe each of these communities, and I've pulled up one here for the single family home community directly adjacent to Runyon Canyon, and this multifamily home community in the Westlake MacArthur Park area, to show you just a very brief. So that area next to Runyon Canyon is described as having a moderately increased as capitalist motion picture stars with incomes of every year of $3,600 a year and upward, no foreign families, no nationalities, no Negroes, and no apparent or anticipated shifting or infiltration. Which you may look at that and think, well, what is shifting or infiltration? Well, the next one, the description of Westlake MacArthur Park, makes that a little clearer for us. Because in that area, they said the population was only slowly increasing, comprised of skilled artisans, laborers, white collar and works progress administration workers with incomes of $700 to $2,000 a year, 20% foreign families, nationalities of Japanese and Russians and some Mexicans, 10% Negro, and shifting or infiltration of Japs and Negroes rapidly. Now, again, these are official documents that were used from 1936 to 1968 for 32 years to determine whether or not you would be eligible for a federally backed mortgage in either of these communities. So in other words, if you were trying to get a home in this Westlake MacArthur Park community, A, you couldn't because it was redlined, and B, the reason it was redlined, as described here, is because there were a lot of immigrants, because it was 10% black households, and that they identified that there was and black households who were moving into the community, and their numbers were growing in the community relative to where they had been. Unlike the community next to Runyon Canyon, where they identified it was all white. It was all white, but there was another important detail in here as well that's a little lower down the document here, which is that In the area that was outlined in green, they noted it has what they described as racial protection in perpetuity. Now you might wonder, well, what the heck does that mean? That means deed restrictions. Someone who is not Caucasian, not white. So they saw this as, there is no way this community is ever going to be anything but white, and therefore it's green. Therefore, if you want to get a federally backed home mortgage for this neighborhood, you will have no problem because it's only ever going to be white folks living here. As compared to the folks, the Westlake MacArthur Park community, where they said the deed restrictions, quote, leave much to be desired, but do protect against racial hazards. Again, there's this term, racial hazards, for the purposes of federal mortgage lending. Anything that would potentially open up to a community being less white over time was deemed to be a hazard, deemed to be a risk that they would not want the federal government to be supporting private home mortgages in that community, because it might be a community that's going to be less white over time. These are just two. You can Google this real quick and find the redlining maps all across the LA region, where you can actually see these documents. There's actually a map. There's an organization that's done this for the whole country, so you can see them all across the country. These descriptions are not unique to Los Angeles and how they looked at our communities. But they're quite eye-opening if you're not familiar with this part of our history, that this was over a generation's worth of home ownership opportunities that were dictated explicitly on the basis of race. Toward the Vieira red line, we start to see something that has sort of been coined here as white flight. In LA County, we have 88 cities. Well over a third of those cities were incorporated in a 3-year span in the mid-1950s. This is an important moment in time because we had emerged from World War II. We had the baby boom that occurred more for bigger homes. And so what did they do? They incorporated communities en masse throughout LA County, and white folks moved out to these almost exclusively single family communities that very much touted their quote unquote local control. So that even at a time when deed restrictions, as you'll recall, which had been made unenforceable by the courts in 1948, even at a time when they were no longer enforceable through the courts, local control offered a new mechanism for communities to control. So we see this proliferation of these much smaller communities across the county. And I included a photo here of Lakewood because Lakewood, city, it attempted something that no city had been able to do before, which was to say, we're not going to provide our own. We're gonna contract with the county. We'll provide our own local planners and our own local elected officials, but the county, we'll contract with the county to provide our policing, our law enforcement and fire services and emergency services. And this was something that the Supreme Court upheld, said, yep, you can go ahead and do that, Lakewood. Once they did that, once Lakewood was allowed to do that, we saw an explosion of contract cities all throughout LA County, over 30 of these cities that all created, because one of the biggest barricades to incorporating as a small city was having to stand up your own law enforcement, your own fire department. When they no longer had to do this, it became much easier for cities to incorporate. And then we see freeways, which came about at the exact same time as we were seeing the proliferation of these small incorporated white flight cities. These are two historic photographs showing the construction on the left-hand side here of the I-10 freeway, where it joins the I-110 freeway. This is downtown LA in the background here. You can see City Hall right there. And you'll see here where the freeway is getting built. One of the things I think is really important to see about that and about this photo here, where you see that the 110 freeway being built downtown. These were existing communities. These were not places that were just empty and we put a bunch of freeways on them. These were whole communities where we tore out homes up and down these corridors and displaced tens of thousands of people to build these freeways. And at the time we were doing this, in the 50s and 60s especially, don't forget, redlining was still the law of the land. So let's say you're a white homeowner in a location that has been deemed as now a corridor for a freeway, and they're coming through and they're going to take your home down. Well, you can buy a home in another community because you're white, and there are communities where a white homeowner can buy another federally backed home. If you are a black or brown homeowner, if you're fortunate enough to be a homeowner, because it was much, much harder to get any kind of financial support to do that for black and brown households, or a renter, you can't leave. Where are you going to go? You can't go to the green or blue designated areas on that redlining map. You're not allowed. Now, there may be some places to go that are yellow or red on the map, but you're forced out with very little opportunity to go elsewhere. So what we saw with freeways was just a massive displacement that really gutted existing neighborhoods. I would note there was a quote that we didn't actually end up even building 100% of the freeways that we had planned for the LA region. We only built about 60% of the planned freeways. But there's a quote from a local activist I saw recently that said, we only built 60% of the freeways for the region, but we built 100% of the freeways through our low-income communities, which is to say, in the low-income communities in LA, all the freeways that we plan to build, we built them. We destroyed those communities by just gutting them with these freeways. One of those communities in particular is Boyle Heights. Boyle Heights, before we built all the freeways, was one of the most integrated communities in Los Angeles. And once we built the freeways, the Italian and Jewish families, mostly white families in that community in Boyle Heights, left. They could leave, and they did leave. And that left a lot of black and brown households to stay in Boyle Heights, in an area where there were now multiple freeways crisscrossing the community. I share this photo here because for those of us who drive around our freeways in LA today, it's not a particularly notable photo. It doesn't even look like the traffic's terrible, right? This is the Western overcrossing, Western Avenue over the I-10 freeway. This is notable because this is Sugar Hill. And you say, well, what's Sugar Hill? Sugar Hill is a community that, so back when we were seeing more segregation of housing with the redlining maps, a lot of our black households in LA ended up relocated into South Central LA. South Central, so south of downtown, became sort of LA's black community. And in the late 30s or 40s, there were some black performers in the entertainment business and movies, in theater, who looked to buy homes that were of significant wealth, and found that opportunity in Sugar Hill, which is a community of large homes that a number of white households, white homeowners left because they wanted to go to Beverly Hills or they wanted to go somewhere on the west side. And they were one of the first areas where we started to see black households purchasing large homes with their own, with the dollars they had to bring. Right? Like, they couldn't get a federally backed mortgage. They had a lot of money from being in the movie business or being in the stage business or whatever. And Sugar Hill became the notable, the community of notoriety for wealthy black families. It was only the case for about 15, 20 years. And then we saw some version into some of the more traditional communities we think of today as black communities around LA, and Leimert Park, Crenshaw. I'll dive into that a little bit more a little later. But Sugar Hill was on the list of possible alternatives for the I-10 freeway. And ultimately it came down to, do we build the I-10 freeway through Sugar Hill, or do we build the I-10 freeway through the fraternity sorority road just north of USC? And ultimately our transportation planners, in their eminent wisdom, decided to obliterate Sugar Hill and drove this freeway directly through the heart of the historic wealthy Black community in LA, which I say historic and all that. This was a notorious community. Like it was notable for being a place of wealthy Black homeowners, people of note. It was known across the country, and we put a freeway right down the middle of it. Which is not to say they didn't fight it, but it turns out political agency is something we give more to, systemically is given more to white folks than to Black and brown folks. So I want to note a little bit about downzoning too, because I indicated that on the timeline. Downzoning really came about, it sort of came into vogue for us, and we've never described it in those terms. These are my terms. To call it well, it's not my term, but it's what I'm calling it. Basically from the early to mid 1950s all the way through the 1980s. And I've offered here an example of the impact of just one downzoning policy here in the city of LA. The image here on this slide is of what is affectionately called a dingbat. Dingbats are one of the more naturally affordable kinds of housing in LA. And they tend to look fairly similar. It's this 2 or 3 story apartment building on stilts where you've got parking directly underneath it. And usually the buildings are anywhere from 5 to 10 units. They don't tend to be much larger, but they were very popular to build at a very specific moment in time because they are affordable to build, and because it was a way for people who own property to make a little money. We're not talking huge developers here. We're talking about average folks who said, I can create 4, 5, 6, 7 apartments, whatever the case may be, make a little money and make some new housing for some folks. So these really took off starting really kind of in the mid 1950s. Shortly after this boom started, parking minimums were increased to 1.25 spaces per unit. And so what we see as a result of that, and what we actually still see today in much of the housing that gets built in our multifamily zones, is that architects would work backwards. So they would look at the space of a property and say, okay, how many parking spaces can I fit on that property? And they would determine, based on the number of parking spaces they could fit on a property, how many apartments they could build. However, in 1964, we increased parking minimums just a little bit from 1.25 spaces per unit to 1.5 spaces per unit. And that led to the end of the mass production of dingbats. Not to say that we didn't still build some, but they suddenly became utterly unaffordable for most people to build. So we really see just about a decade span of time, and that's it for the construction of this very unique archetype of housing in LA, which remains today some of the most affordable housing that we have anywhere in the city. But 1964 is kind of an important year in our history when it comes to housing here in California. 1964 is when the voters of California also approved Proposition 14 that November. In 1963, the state legislature passed the Rumford Act. Now remember, housing discrimination on the basis of race is still legal. Redlining is still legal. The Fair Housing Act passed in 1968 at the federal level, so it is still legal to discriminate on the basis of race. And Democrats in the state legislature introduced the Rumford Act to bar discrimination on the basis of race in housing. Now, it was amended so that only applied to buildings of 5 units or more. This is the only way they are able to get a majority of votes in the state legislature and to get this bill signed by Governor Pat Brown. And that bill became a flashpoint. And in 1964, Proposition 14 was placed on the ballot to overturn the Rumford Act, to make it legal once again to ban or to discriminate on the basis of race. And here we have a pamphlet in support of Proposition 14, which talks about restoring property owners' rights to choose the person or persons to whom they wish to sell or rent their residential property, and restoring rights basic to our freedom, to permit all persons to decide for themselves what to do with their own property. So here we have property rights and freedom of choice And really what's at stake here is being able to say, I don't want to rent my apartment to someone who is not white. And it just so happens that this became a big issue in the 1966 governor's race, which I'll get to in a moment. But in 1964, the voters of California approved Proposition 14, 65 to 35. It was not even close. This was an overwhelming 2-to-1 majority in support of continuing discrimination on the basis of race in housing in California. And in LA County, we approved it 70% in favor of Proposition 14. So LA County said, all the way, we want to be able to discriminate on the basis of race in housing. Now, Proposition 14 ended up getting taken all the way up to the courts and lost at the US Supreme Court in 1967, where they overturned it saying, you're denying people's basic constitutional rights. But that's a 3-year span from after it passed. And in that time, in 1966, a young man named Ronald Reagan, a young actor, got elected as the new governor of the state of California, defeating Pat Brown, who was running for a 3rd term. Pat Brown had taken a position of opposition to Proposition 14. Ronald Reagan made it one of the very first things he announced when he was governor-elect, that he would repeal the Rumford Act and that he supported the actions behind Proposition 14. So here we are. Many of us know, of Ronald Reagan and Pat Brown's son, Jerry Brown, who was governor for the last couple terms of governor. And this is not ancient history. And this was not a slim margin in support of housing discrimination. This was 2-to-1. And that was just 55 years ago. I want to talk a little bit about urban renewal. Urban renewal is a euphemism for let's tear down communities that we've deemed to be slums. This is a community that no longer exists in Los Angeles, but did for many, many years. This community is Bunker Hill. We don't think of Bunker Hill this way today. You may not even know what Bunker Hill is. This was Bunker Hill in the 1970s, completely gutted and razed and all the homes removed. Bunker Hill is where we now have our civic center. We have our performing arts complex on the top of the hill. It's where the Walt Disney Concert Hall is located. So Bunker Hill used to be a bunch of homes, but unfortunately in the redlining maps, it was redlined because it was too many mixed races. It was not a uniformly white community, and the homes were much older and didn't have the deed restrictions and was subject to racial hazards, as those maps put it. And so therefore, it was a community that was not invested in as part of our emergence from the Great Depression and federally backed mortgages. And we ultimately chose to completely tear it all down. And that is now where we have the center of downtown with our civic center. But I want to also just note that urban renewal is not just LA. One of the more notable examples of urban renewal in LA was with Dodger Stadium and Elysian Park, and removing thousands of primarily Mexican families from the park in order to end up becoming building the Dodger Stadium. That was not why it was necessarily communities were removed from Elysian Park, but that is ultimately what we did with it. But this isn't just LA. We see examples of this throughout the country. The Great Arch in St. Louis was a whole community that was torn out. Space Needle in Seattle, and the World Trade Center in New York. Also communities where, basically if you find large 1960s construction in any 1960s, 1970s construction in any big city, it was probably an urban renewal project where they did what they called slum clearance and removed a community they didn't like, and then put some big thing down to put a stamp down, like we're never going back to whatever that was before. I've mentioned, we already discussed the freeways and the impact that those had. Those are a very similar kind of thing. So this is what we've done with our cities. So I want to talk just a little bit about constriction. So I talk about downzoning, but I'm going to reterm this here in the middle of this presentation, but as constriction. So we've done a number of things. enacted a number of policies which reduced the available space for construction of new housing. In 1960, when redlining was still the law of the land, our zone capacity in the city of LA allowed for 10 million residents, the capacity to have housing for 10 million people. But we downzoned like crazy. We constricted all across the city through a number of different kinds of policies that were all intended to do what they've done, which was to reduce our zone capacity down to, in 1990, just under 4 million residents. Now, as we know, today in 2020, we have over 4 million residents in the city of LA. And it just so happens that through some minor tweaks here and there to our community plans in the intervening 3 decades, we've increased the zone capacity slightly. And it's barely kept pace with our population growth. But we used to allow for, our zoning used to allow for up to 10 million, zoning for up to 10 million residents. I note here a couple of the different kinds of policies. I already talked about dingbats and the impact of parking requirements, which were increased the same year that the voters overwhelmingly approved restrictions or going back to allowing for discrimination on the basis of race in housing. So we increased parking minimums, we reduced height limits, we've limited max densities. So in other words, a property which once could have maybe have had 4 homes on it could now only accommodate 2 homes because we said you had to have, X amount more space per home on the property. We increased yards and setback requirements. Why do we have yards in LA? This isn't a particularly, our environment is not particularly conducive to grass. Grass is not native to LA, and it's not something that's normal for us to put all over our land and soak up all of this water. Well, we require yards. We require them as a mechanism to reduce the density on our land, in our city. Setbacks, why do we require 5 feet here and 10 feet there and 15 feet there? A lot of these things appear almost arbitrary, but they were very much intended to restrict opportunities for other people to be able to move into our communities, to create more housing within our communities. And they worked. They worked as intended, and we reduced our zone capacity by 60% in 3 decades. And in the intervening years, in the 3 decades since, we've probably increased it to about 4.5 to 5 million. This change being our transit-oriented communities bill measure JJJ, which the voters approved in 2016. Another way we can see constrict we see built, in this case, in Silver Lake, on 2 properties that are the same size, directly adjacent to each other. The building on the right was built almost a century ago with 28 studio and 1-bedroom apartments, has no parking spaces. It's 3 stories tall, as you can see in the photo here. And today, a studio apartment there rents for $1,500 a month. The building on the left was built just under a decade ago in 2013. 11 2-bedroom condos with 20 parking spaces, so just about 2 spaces per condo. It's a 4-story building, and each condo sells for $1.1 million. The building on the left is what they could build there today. You could not build the building on the right today because of the parking requirements, for no other reason because of the parking requirements. But as soon as you add in all that parking requirement, the only way that you're going to see new housing get built is if they build it bigger so that they can get more money back for it to afford building all of that parking, because parking is incredibly expensive to build. So what is the effect of all of these changes in policies? We actually used to build a lot more what I'm calling here mid-sized housing, so 2 to 10 unit buildings. Those dingbats that we saw built in a span of a decade, where we saw a whole bunch of them get built across the city, but now it's near impossible. So we're building many more large housing projects on much smaller overall land area. So you can see this in this data here. Of all of our existing housing, all the housing across LA today, 8% of our existing housing is found in 2 to 4 unit buildings, and 10% is found in 50 unit buildings. So only a tenth of all of our existing housing is found in 10 or 50 or more unit buildings. But those buildings account for 43% of all the housing we've built in this century. So for the last 2 decades, even though they account for only 1/10 of all our existing housing, 50+ unit buildings account for almost half of all the housing we built in the last 20 years. And then I also note on this chart here, that since 2000, of all the 2 to 4 unit buildings we have currently, 4% of them have been built since 2000. And of all the 50 unit buildings we have currently, 21% of them have been built since 2000, which is to say, we used to build more mid-sized housing, but now we're building primarily very large housing projects on much limited land area. A case in point here is downtown LA. Downtown LA is 1% of the city's land area, but the site of over 20% of all of the housing we built in the last 2 decades. And in 2018, downtown LA accounted for half of all the new homes that we built that year. So downtown LA, which is a tiny piece of new housing, and the article that talked about the half of LA's 10,000 new homes since 2018 also noted that downtown LA rents in the past year increased only 1%, while the rest of the city averaged about an 8% rent increase. So they were sort of tying these things together, but making the point that we think of downtown LA, many of us think of downtown LA as being sort of a lot of these luxury homes, a lot of these sort of shiny, brand new buildings, and that it's unaffordable to many, many people. But in reality, for most of the city, the rents are going up much faster everywhere else besides downtown LA. And downtown LA, in many ways, maybe looks like the shiny new luxury buildings because it's one of the only places we're even allowing new housing to get built. And just about anywhere else in the city of LA, it's not even happening. So that's a lot of our history. It's been the first hour. We're going to kind of move through a little more quickly here as we go through. So how does Bob Ross, rest in peace, Bob, talking about, ever make mistakes, let's make them birds. That's their birds, just a little, let's change it up. Let's try to make it look like something different. But I also think that our housing policies of the past are very much the zombies of our present that are very difficult to move past. This chart shows of our existing housing in 2016, this is when this was put together, when it was built. And you'll see that the vast majority of our housing was built before 1990, 87%. And in fact, if you look at the housing built up to 1969, which is around the time when we finally made it illegal to discriminate on the basis of race in housing, that's over 2/3 of all the housing in the city of LA was built at a time when discrimination on the basis of race was perfectly legal. And in fact, not just legal, but was how we did business in housing. And we can all say, well, it's no longer the case, and you could certainly buy or sell or rent a home irrespective of race today, although we'll see in a little bit that's not entirely true. But what happened is we had all this housing built and people who were buying housing at a time when it was only available to you to purchase a home, primarily if you were white, and that enabled a great deal of wealth building opportunities for white households only, and that has persisted to this day. So let's talk a little bit about the impact of redlining on our present. So this is the redlining map we saw just a few minutes ago. This is our freeway network in the city of LA. Again, here's Boyle Heights, where we built 100% of the freeways that were planned in Boyle Heights. There was actually a freeway, this stub of the two was supposed to go along Santa Monica Boulevard through Beverly Hills. Happened largely because of opposition in Beverly Hills, which you'll note here. We all know is a very wealthy community today, but was also by design because it was redlined that way in the 1930s. You also note that the two freeway stub ends where that little red spot ends and it turns to yellow. These things are not coincidental. These are, again, by design. And many of the way that our freeways turn and sort of adjust through our communities are directly the result of decisions that were made at a very local level about saving this church or who cares about that park. They just bulldozed freeways wherever. But again, you'll note that we really built our freeways through the areas that were redlined and in some cases yellow, but basically almost nothing that was blue or green, certainly in central Los Angeles. I also included here with these blue stars where that federally funded public housing that we saw got built for about a decade where that housing exists today, almost all in areas that were redlined and a couple in areas that were yellow. No federally funded housing being built in green or blue areas on our redline. So some other ways that redlining still plays out today. Redlining actually accounts for neighborhoods being hotter today in 2020, that in some cases, in this study that was done in the last couple of years, where they looked at 108 urban areas nationwide, formerly redlined neighborhoods were some cases 13 degrees hotter than blue and green areas on those redlining maps. In the city of LA, their data shows about a 4 to 5 degree difference. I think about that on a day like today, where if it's 90 degrees in a green area, it could be 95 degrees in a red or yellow area. Another area where there's a connection between redlining and our present day is in our street designs, and that we actually see that there's disproportionate clusters of traffic violence concentrating fatalities among marginalized groups in our formerly redlined communities. So it's less safe to walk or bike communities, in no small part because of the way we designed our streets in those communities. And right now, obviously, but we're talking a lot about policing. It turns out that predominantly Black neighborhoods, i.e. neighborhoods that were redlined in the 30s, are both over-policed when it comes to surveillance and social control, and under-policed when it comes to emergency services. So providing people with the ability to get to the hospital in emergency. And there's an author who did the tough sociologist, who one of the things they noted in this study was that they find that policing responds to segregated landscapes, but it also maintains them. So the areas that were redlined, where we segregated out our communities over more than a generation of time, from 1936 to 1968, and a lot of that segregation remains today. Policing responds to that, and it also constructs and maintains that existing segregation. Here we are also in the midst of the COVID pandemic, and we're seeing that redlining plays out again, both in terms of the prevalence of COVID-19, where our formerly redlined communities are where we're seeing much higher prevalence of this virus, and also in terms of job losses. So our redlined communities are both being hit the hardest in terms of the disease and also its economic impacts. Now, we also see overcrowding. LA County there was a study done a few years ago that showed that LA County is about 500,000 affordable units short of what it needs right now, affordable homes short of what it needs. That's largely something that happens because we have so much overcrowding, where we have more people living in a home than there are bedrooms to accommodate them. We're seeing that overcrowding primarily, almost exclusively, in formerly redlined communities, just to the west and south of downtown LA. So again, redlining was the law of the land. You might say it was all so long ago, but the ripple effects, the echo effects of redlining have perpetuated for decades and decades and decades. And one of the things I really want to note here is, and I didn't say this in the federal government approved the Fair Housing Act, which finally said you cannot discriminate on the basis of housing accommodations. That was being held up in the Congress by Republicans for a number of months. It finally passed 1 week after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And you can no longer discriminate on the basis of race and housing accommodations. It did not offer any mechanism for people who had been discriminated against for decades up until that point to actually re-engage in a meaningful way. So congratulations, you are a Black person whose parents and grandparents were unable to access housing on account of explicitly racist policies for generations. Now you can go ahead and buy one of these homes in a former community that was excluded you on the basis of race. But oh, by the way, because your family's been unable to build wealth for generations, good luck. And the Fair Housing Act didn't speak to any of that. It just said, okay, it's an even playing field now. And as we can see, these things have had ripple effects between the heat and traffic violence and policing and overcrowding and COVID-19, they just continue on and on and on. And I want to note a little bit about housing density here with these maps. So I'm going to highlight these communities right here in mid-Wilshire. The one circled in green is actually the La Brea producing tar pits. That's why there's no color on that part of the map, because it wasn't actually designated for housing at the time. The map was made in 1936. It was actually, they were actually getting oil out of it. And then right here is Miracle Mile North, just directly adjacent to the tar pits. Those communities today, the tar pits were converted into Park La Brea because the city needed to build a bunch of housing for veterans returning from World War II. And what do? We built Park La Brea, which is the most dense housing complex, the largest housing complex west of the Mississippi, with over 10,000 residents. Compare or contrast that with Miracle Mile North, which is a community directly to the north of Park La Brea, which was built in the 1920s. And Miracle Mile North was one of LA's was almost exclusively white, remains very much exclusively white. And it is a historic preservation overlay zone now. So there's no way to add an apartment building here because it would violate the terms of the HPLZ. One of the things I just want to note is Park La Brea is 6 times more densely populated than Miracle Mile North. Just offering here a couple other images of housing archetypes across the city of LA. This is the Encino Hills. And this map here shows you all the pink areas that are shaded pink are areas which are single family zoning only. Everything that's blue is multifamily. You can build a single family home in blue, but you cannot build a multifamily home in the pink area. That's that 75-25 I was talking about earlier. This is San Fernando Valley. This is Westlake MacArthur Park here. And then this is the Condo Canyon along Wilshire, which you can see indicate this little tiny blue strip here along Wilshire Boulevard leading into UCLA directly on the west here. And Condo Canyon is this bizarre location, I call it bizarre, in LA, where we allow these massive buildings directly along Wilshire Boulevard, and then directly adjacent to them you can only build single family homes, and they are incredibly expensive homes. I did say I'd say a little about CEQA. Just a couple things about CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. A study in 2015 found that fewer than 1 in 8 CEQA lawsuits were actually filed by groups with prior records of environmental advocacy. So who was filing the other 7 out of 8 CEQA lawsuits? Mostly folks who were just trying to stop something and found CEQA to be a convenient way to do it. Because if they were concerned about environmental advocacy, they would have been more than 1 in 8 of those CEQA lawsuits. And 80% of CEQA lawsuits target infill housing. That is housing getting built in cities, as opposed to what we call greenfield housing, which is housing getting built in the urban fringes. The Legislative Analyst's Office looked at CEQA's impacts and found that projects requiring a full environmental impact report take 2.5 years to approve. So requiring that adds a ton of time, and time is money when you're trying to build housing in a community. The biggest infill housing for CEQA, or infill housing concern that's raised in CEQA, is traffic. That is changing now with the state sort of providing some new measures for how to look at CEQA and its impacts on transportation, but CEQA has been used time and time again to fight infill housing in our cities. I'm just noting this quickly because I think it's valuable, but common interest developments or gated communities are now where over 1/4 of all Californians live. CIDs came about as a result of racial strife in the South Bay in the 1950s. They became very popular as a way to keep out people of certain types. You can guess who those folks are. They basically, because they have a single monotype of housing, they tend to attract the same kinds of folks. So that is something that we're not going to dive in, but just noting it because it is such a big part of our housing stock in the state of California is common interest developments or gated communities. Going back to this question of home ownership, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau just a couple of years ago looked at racism in home ownership today and found that for those applying for a conventional home loan, with all else being equal, just the race being the thing that separated them, Black applicants were denied a conventional home loan almost 3 times more often than white applicants in 2017. And when it comes to home refinancing, which is one of the ways that home ownership remains affordable for a lot of folks, is being able to refinance when mortgage rates drop. Black applicants were denied as often as white applicants, holding all else constant, just race. So for those folks saying, you know, well, we passed the 1968 Fair Housing Act, we've had decades and decades and all this, you know, all these things have, you know, over time have solved these challenges. Not true, not true. And it is very much playing out today. And in the city of LA, 45% of our white households in the city of LA own their home, as compared to 20% of black households. So the disparities play out, which is not to say, again, I'm not denying here that there are black homeowners in the city of LA, and there were black homeowners during redlining. It is to say that our housing policies are systemically racist and continue to function in that manner. Whether we intend them to or not, that is how they function. Because here we are 52 years after the Fair Housing Act, and we're still seeing a 2-to-1 disparity in terms of home ownership on the basis of race and in terms of who can access home loans. I mentioned the lending debacle of the early 2000s. That led to this stat here, where 30% of black and brown borrowers' homes in total had gone into foreclosure in the years since the 2008 housing market crash, compared with 11% of whites' homes. So we just see this remarkable disparity that is only explained on the basis of race. Black home ownership today is about the same as it was in 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed. And the black and white home ownership gap is larger today than it has been any time in the last 3 decades. So we're not seeing like the trend lines moving in the right direction or in a better direction. We're seeing them either static or regressing in terms of equality. This is a map that I just wanted to offer because someone had asked recently about, well, how can we see this in the current state of things? This is a map that is the 2010 census. There's 4 colors. There's blue, red, orange, and green. And each dot on this map, which you can't, if you can see those dots, good luck. But each dot indicates 50 people. All right, each dot is 50 people as counted by the 2010 census. The blue dots are white people. The red dots are Asian. The orange dots are designated by the census as Hispanic, and the green dots are black. And the further apart the dots are, that is single family, where you see sort of like white in between, that is single family. And you'll note that most of the areas in here where they're spread out dots, they're mostly blue dots. They're not exclusively blue dots, but they're mostly blue dots, which is to say that most of the areas where a single family home communities in LA are also white. Now we do see obviously the exceptions around here, where we have Ladera Heights and Crenshaw and Inglewood, where we see a lot more black home ownership in single family home communities. We also see that where we have orange dots especially, it's much more densely packed, also red dots. And I would just note that some of our most racially mixed communities we see here in Hollywood, around UCLA, in Palms, here's Park La Brea right here, pops out on the map, Koreatown, and downtown LA, and then also here around USC. Historic Preservation Overlay Zones, which the City of LA adopted in 1979, they enable additional property tax reductions to existing homeowners. So in other words, you've already got the Prop 13 tax freeze, and now we also can give you HPOZs. However, they also add a bunch of layers of review for any modifications. So if you want to put a new door on your house, you want to plant a new tree, you want to change your sidewalk, your fence, you have to go through a whole review process with a whole panel of folks who get to decide what color you can paint your door and whether they approve it or not, whether it's gonna violate the terms of the Historic Preservation Overlay Zone. We see some really large HPOZs in the communities that are right around here, where we've got Hancock Park, Hancock Park, Windsor Square. We've got Miracle Mile North, Carthay Square, Carthay Circle. So these single family communities in central LA, where it's much more sparsely populated and almost exclusively, but not entirely exclusively white, are also HPOZs. Housing discrimination is still very much what's happening in many ways beyond just sort of this black-white dichotomy in home ownership. And I just note a few headlines that have popped up in the last year around discrimination in housing. Last couple of years, we're still seeing this happening in many ways across the state, across the city. It is part of our history. It is part of our present. I want to touch briefly on homelessness. The main cause of homelessness is housing unaffordability. This has been studied. It is not mental health. It is not drug addiction. It is people who are on the edge of, on the verge of losing their homes because they can't afford them anymore, or they lose job or whatever, or they're housing insecure and something happens and they are out of their home. For every person who's homeless, there are at least 10 more people who are right on that edge. And the biggest thing we see in our homelessness is this churn, where we get so many folks out of homelessness in a year, but we get even more of them who become homeless. And those numbers keep going up. I just want to note here, I think this is an important thing to be aware of, that while LA County's population, 8% of our county population is Black, 33% of our homeless are Black. To me, this is exactly what happens when your housing policies are systemically racist for a century and make housing unaffordable for so many years explicitly on the basis of race, and then de facto on the basis of race. I offer here the Centennial Project as one example of how we've done housing and how we continue to do housing, unfortunately. And one of the ways that CEQA kind of fails us. Centennial Project, this is the Tejon Ranch. If you've ever driven on the I-5 up to the San Joaquin Valley, and then you have gone through the Tejon Ranch, the Centennial Project was approved by the LA County Board of Supervisors last year. This location is 60 miles north of downtown LA and 30 miles south of Bakersfield. The proposal is for 19,300 homes for 57,000 residents at a density of 1.5 homes per acre, which is significantly lower than most of LA. It's about the same density as Rancho Palos Verdes in southwest LA County. And thankfully, they designated 18% of these homes will be designated affordable, but they've described this as a environmentally sensitive community that'll be green and LEED friendly, all sorts of great things, because they're going to have some biking paths and some walkable villages in it. But of course, anyone can see that if for anyone to try and have a job living in Centennial, you're going to have to get in your car and drive for an hour in any direction, because there's nothing around there. And there's also a high wildfire zone. So this is the impact of zone capacity or constriction in our history as present for LA. And the California Legislative Analyst's Office put it quite simply that building less housing than people demand drives high housing costs. So I indicated on both of these charts with a red line when redlining was still the law of the land. But you can see here, as redlining was about to be put out to pasture, as it were, we started significantly downzoning in the city of LA. You've seen that chart already. This chart shows that even though housing costs have been higher on average in the state of California than the rest of the country, you can see that here, they're slightly higher. The black bar indicates that, that they thoroughly decouple in the 1980s and onward. That redlining was no longer the law of the land. Suddenly our housing prices were escalating dramatically. These things are not unrelated. They are directly connected. At the same time that we were significantly downzoning and constricting new housing opportunities, and we saw housing prices start to escalate. And so what did we do in California? We passed Proposition 13, which locked in property taxes for all of our existing homeowners, and then also substantially made housing more expensive for the rest of us, because there was less incentive for existing homeowners to support new housing, and people who are buying new housing are the ones getting hit with the property tax bills of the increasingly expensive housing across the state. So I want to leave you with, I want to sort of wrap with this really important, I think, really important idea about single-family housing. Single-family housing has been a wildly successful, affordable housing program, if you're white, because what it did is it opened up all sorts of new land and home ownership opportunities at a time when it was relatively affordable in the early to mid 20th century, with federally backed lending, which enabled people to build wealth. And we see that play out with the wealth and disparities that exist today. Single family housing has tax write-offs, which are a significant benefit as an affordable housing component. And then, of course, Prop 13, which the voters approved in 1978. Municipal governments and the state government used to rely quite heavily on property taxes, but now they've had to shift that to sales taxes, which, as we know, put the burden much more heavily on lower income communities. So we've seen this massive shift from the municipal finance being largely being paid for from property taxes, which are, as a result of wealthy homeowners, to sales taxes, which all of us kind of share and are disproportionately impact lower income communities. And I put here also political agency and power. We've created these communities that are firmly established and now act as the arbiters of what can and cannot happen in their boundaries. Oh, you want to build an apartment building here in X community? Well, that's going to have to go through this and this and this and this layer of our approval. So we've taken that model of California Article 34, which said, oh, you want to build affordable housing, you need the support of the voters, and we've hyper localized it so that these single family homeowners who have built wealth and created wealth for over decades through policies that were intended to make that possible for them, and particularly for white homeowners, we've empowered them with the ability to be sort of the arbiters of what can and cannot happen in their communities. I would describe this as a wildly successful affordable housing program. If you look at our existing affordable housing programs today, you have to be at a certain income level and stay there. As soon as you start to earn more money, you have challenges staying within that existing housing. You're not allowed to generate and build wealth with our existing affordable housing programs, but we did allow that with our federally backed home mortgages for decades. So let's talk a little bit about the LA region and who's in charge here. LA is huge. We have 10 million residents. If we were our own state, we'd be the 8th largest of them in the country. So there's a lot there. We're also very, very, we have myriad overlapping governance structures here, right? We have 88 cities. We have 1 million residents who live in unincorporated LA County. We have all these congressional districts. Every one of our 88 cities has their own city council, has their own mayor. So this is to say, who gets to decide? I mean, I talked about the city of LA in 2016, but that's just the city of LA. That doesn't apply to Burbank or to Pasadena or to Glendale or Santa Monica or Long Beach or wherever. It's just the city of LA. So who's in charge? So then we'll talk a little bit here about our theory of change for abundant housing LA. There's 3 things we see that abundant housing is really important and why we are key about, or why we care about this so much. 1, we want everyone to have a home they can afford. 2, we want communities that are more livable and sustainable. 3, we want to address the urgent climate crisis, which maybe isn't really getting all the headlines today, with COVID being the thing that's grabbing all the headlines. But in case anyone hasn't noticed, we just saw our tropical storm Faye, the first time an F-named storm has appeared this early in the hurricane season in recorded history. We are seeing heat records falling all across the planet this year. If it was not for COVID, climate change would be the headline right now because things are overheating all over the planet. So everyone having a home they can afford. Legislative analysts for the state of California reported a few years back saying that building less housing than people demand drives high housing costs. They did say that affordable housing programs have a role. So it is this inclusionary zoning that we do, these policies we provide are an important part of providing affordable housing. And overall, policies need to be able to change to allow, in California, or in Canada, the Smart Prosperity Institute did an analysis looking at the cost per household for a local government to provide a set of services, depending on whether that household. And it turns out that in a more densely populated, multi-residential zoned area, the cost per household for all of these things is significantly cheaper, including for water and for sidewalks and for sewage treatment and for our roads and our policing and our governance, our transportation, you name it, is significantly cheaper in an urban environment. This is something to think about when you hear people say, well, we can't have more people because how are we going to pay for the water, or how are we going to pay for the sewage? Well, it's actually a lot cheaper if we have them in our cities than if we send them all out to Centennial in the Tejon Ranch. In terms of addressing the climate crisis, the Victoria Transport Policy Institute in Canada looked at the cost of sprawl and found that sprawl increases per capita land consumption by up to 80%, car use by 60%. In other words, if you're in a sprawling household versus in a sprawling community, in a house there versus in a house in a inner city, you're going to use a lot more land, and you're going to use your car a lot more. And the International Panel on Climate Change at the United Nations reported just a couple years ago, basically that they felt that effective urban planning could reduce greenhouse gas emissions from urban transport between 20 and 50%, which is essentially what we need to do in order to reach this target that the entire planet has agreed, well, except for the US now with the Paris Climate Accords, that is an important target for us to reach. And the way to really get at that is so you can't have you can't have a housing crisis if you build more houses. Our pro-housing agenda for Abundant Housing LA calls for 5 things. 1, make more room for more homes. Simple, maybe, but controversial. Make it easier and cheaper and faster to build homes. Raise money for affordable homes. Protect tenants and encourage innovation. I want to just note quickly on the challenge here our part of our agenda around protecting tenants. This is an important part of this because I noted earlier about how we're building larger buildings on smaller areas of land. For a very long time, our approach to housing has been, we can build multifamily housing in areas where it's already zoned for multifamily housing. Well, no surprise here, but we already have multifamily housing in areas where we've zoned for multifamily housing in many, many cases. So a lot of times these larger buildings come at the expense of smaller buildings, which are often already naturally affordable. They're rent controlled, or whatever the case may be, they're more affordable. They're that 28 unit building in Silver Lake with no parking, but the units are renting at $1,600 a month, which is not as expensive than trying to buy a condo next door for $1.1 million. So protecting tenants is a key part of this, but also this idea of making more room for more homes means we shouldn't only be building multifamily housing where we've only ever allowed it for decades. We should expand the map to allow for more 2, 3, 4 mid-sized housing, 2, 3, 4 unit, 8 unit, 10 unit buildings in areas where we've only ever allowed for 1 unit per property for decade after decade after decade. So I'm hoping that you're thinking of getting involved. And if so, we've got some great ideas for you. For starters, join us. Join Abundant Housing LA. You can become a member. Work that we do, and follow us on social media, on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. I will talk in a minute about what it means to be an Abundant Housing LA project volunteer, but that's one thing you can do as well. I need to change the slide. It's not attend hearings, it's, I guess, call into or Zoom into or whatever it is that happens right now in the midst of all of this. But housing gets discussed in a number of venues. Neighborhood councils discuss housing. The zoning administrator at the planning department will discuss housing proposals. The city planning commission, the city council. By the time something's gotten to city council, it's usually a very big project that's incredibly controversial because it's been appealed a myriad times all the way to city council. And there's, so where I think there's more opportunity to really influence, effectively influence this process is really at the local, like the zoning administrator or the neighborhood council. Like the very first time that any of these sort of have any discussion in a public forum, to get out there and learn more, get involved. And also writing and calling your city council office may seem like a really, really basic thing, but what city council members are not accustomed to hearing from folks saying, I like this project, or I want this housing, or we need this housing to be built here. That's not something they're used to hearing. They're much more accustomed to hearing just the opposite. One other way to really find out more about ways to get involved is to contact Roderick Hall, who's our organizing director at Abundant Housing LA, and I've offered his email here for you as well. One thing specifically we're working on right now is the Regional Housing Needs Assessment Arena, which will set the table for Southern California for the next 8 years to have to provide the zone capacity for 1.3 million homes. There are a lot of different fights happening around RENA at the very local city level, at the state level, at the regional Southern California Association of Governments level. There are bills being proposed at the state level that would functionally obliterate what we could see happen with RENA. There are efforts happening at the local level to still try and sort of eat away at this. But what RENA says is each individual city, you have to lay out over the next 8 years how you're going to allow for whatever number of homes to get built. And this year, for the first time in a very, very long time, perhaps ever, cities are really having to be held to account and having to really demonstrate that they've got the capacity to allow for more housing to be built across the region, not just in the city of LA and not just in whatever other city, but across Southern California. But we have to hold our elected leaders' feet to the fire on this. We have to hold our planning departments accountable. So this is something that we're really involved with here at Abundant Housing LA. We've had some success with this, and we're going to keep pushing on it. I mentioned project volunteering. That is something where you can really just start to track like what's going on in your community. You can sign up, you can sign on to like get alerts for upcoming hearings that are happening. But this is something where you're actually monitoring what's going on and taking a little time, a couple hours out of your schedule every week to see what sorts of hearings are coming up and engaging other community members around these issues and asking them to show up, to write letters, to make phone calls, to send emails, whatever the case may be. So it's something that it says here mostly at your computer. These days, probably entirely at your computer. But yes, this is something else that we really offer and want people to consider as a way to get involved. So that's my presentation, and I want to thank you all for being here for this, for listening in. And I want to welcome questions now. It's about 1:40, so we have a little bit of time here for some Q&A. And I'll try and answer any questions as best I can, and appreciate the opportunity to share this with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke. This is Esteban again. So we've got a couple of questions, and everybody else who's got questions, please type them in the Q&A box, and we will answer them as they come. So we have a question from Adriana that's she's asking, besides downtown, what other areas of LA have shown the greatest growth or the greatest potential for growth in housing production?
Thank you for that question, Adriana. So I would refer back to that racial dot map that I showed, where the most racially mixed areas we've seen in LA are also some of the areas where we've allowed the most new housing. So besides downtown, Hollywood, Koreatown, North Hollywood, those are the sort of the biggest areas that we've seen any new housing, and not a whole lot else. There are a few other sort of very hyper localized areas, but in the last couple decades, that's about it. And I also want to note, I'm speaking from the city of LA perspective. I know there's been some efforts in other cities, but I'm not as familiar with sort of how other individual cities have zoned for additional capacity.
Thanks, Luke. And we've got a question from Susan, who's with us from Whittier. And she asks, can you provide references for the main cause of homelessness that she can present to her city government in Whittier? And so I actually think that's a good opportunity. I know we get a bunch of questions at Abundant Housing LA around homelessness. And so if you could just talk about the principal causes of it, why it's concentrated where, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would just note that I find fascinating every time that I read a story about homelessness, about sort of what's happening in Irvine or in Sherman Oaks or in wherever the case may be, is every community thinks that it's unique to them. Everyone acts like homelessness is worse in our city than anywhere else, or in our community than anywhere else. And that's just not true. It's just not true. Homelessness is happening everywhere. And as far as reference material, I would have to go back and see what specific information is available. I looked back and there were some write-ups that were happening after the 2018 count when they published all of that in 2019. There hasn't been as much that's been made available as a result of the 2020 account that they just published all of that. Sorry. The 2019 account, so they do a count in January of every year. When the 2019 count was published in May, there was some information that was shared then. When the 2020 count, which was done in January of this year, was shared, I want to say it was this last month in June, there was not a whole lot more. It was mostly just reporting it out because frankly, most of the reporting was about COVID and has been. But there are some folks who do research specifically around this at UCLA and USC. So I'll see if I can find some stuff to communicate out to folks who are interested in more information on it. It's not, this isn't hard information to find. It's more just a matter of, frankly, whether or not people are willing to hear it is what I would say. As many times as I have shared this presentation, I've read up on sort of causes of homelessness, sort of what's going on with homelessness. People will tend to sort of feel like, well, I know because I see it on my street. I know that this homeless person is, has a meth addiction, or they've clearly got some mental stability challenges. Well, that may be the case, but many of the homeless we have in our community are not people you see on the street. They may be living in a trailer. They may be living out of their car. We have a lot of homeless that you just don't see. And just because the few that you do see seem to be one thing does not mean that that's what's happening. So I think one of the ways that I would sort of challenge you to think about this, Susan, when you think about how you talk about this in Whittier, sort of what's the story you're trying to tell, and not so much the data, but what's the story? Like why? Because data tends to sort of fall on deaf ears. We think that, oh, well, if I just tell people, here's the data, it's only, that 2/3 of people who are homeless in LA County are from LA County. They lived in LA County for at least 10 years. Okay, well, does that mean anything to someone who's concerned about the person who's, that lives in a tent at the corner of their street? So what's the story? Think about sort of why this is an important issue for you personally, and how you talk about this and relate to people on a personal level. What's at stake? What's at stake for folks, and what are things that we can do to really make a difference, and not just talk about it in terms of data. But I'm happy to see what I can find around data and research that's been done on this to share broadly with the group.
Thanks, Luke. And Susan, I'm happy. This is Esteban again. I'm happy to connect with you afterward, and connect you and Luke afterward, and get you that information. So we've got two actually related questions, one from Scott and one from Gabe. I'll start with Gabe's. Gabe asks, did racial segregation influence the development of the public transportation network as well? And then Scott's question is, what impact has the transit-oriented community program had on housing affordability along the transit corridors where it applies?
Sorry, what impact has
the transit-oriented community program, the TOC program, had on housing affordability along the transit corridors where it applies?
Okay. So I'll answer the second question first. TOC is still a very new program. As you saw, the voters just approved it in November 2016. The city didn't come out with guidelines around this until mid-2017. So we're starting to see projects being built. I think there's been a couple that have actually been completed, but largely it's projects that are in the pipeline, right? They're either being built or they're proposed to be built. So in terms of housing affordability impact, it would probably be too soon to say in sort of broad scale measure. I mean, we need like a 10 or 20 year window to really see real impact. But at the same time, we do know from what's been proposed, what's being built, that we're seeing, I want to say it's over 3,500 units of designated affordable housing in the whole portfolio of housing that's proposed in this program. Because what the program does is give a number of quote unquote incentives to housing builders, that if you provide a certain percentage of affordable housing units, you can then build a little taller, or you can build a little denser, or you can build a little less parking, or whatever the case may be. And so they're doing that. And not only that, but because of the way the program is structured, the incentives are much bigger than have been around in a state bill that's existed for much longer. And so housing builders are actually using TOC program in the city of LA almost exclusively as this way to do this, because it's so much, it helps them sort of move more quickly through the pipeline. So the impact that we're seeing at this point is just that it's just the number. It's just the sheer number of designated affordable units we're seeing come about as a result of this program. I'm not saying that that's sufficient. I don't think it's even remotely sufficient, but it's also significantly more than anything we have seen in a very, very long time. Question around racial segregation influencing public transit. It's a really interesting question, actually. As someone who works in transportation, that is something that I think about. And I think one of the things that's important to note is that LA actually used to have the most extensive streetcar network anywhere in the country. We had over 1,900 miles of streetcars in our heyday in the 1940s and early 50s. Streetcar networks all across our region. Now, that said, the way streetcars operated, they were private companies. And what they did was a streetcar company like Henry Huntington, you've heard of Huntington Park, Huntington is a big name, Huntington Gardens, a big streetcar magnate, would go and buy a bunch of land out somewhere and then build a streetcar line to that piece of land, and then subdivide all the land and sell the land. And with the profits from selling the land to new you realize this doesn't work, because you're talking about financing the operations of an ongoing streetcar with selling land, which you can only do once. So eventually all of these streetcars went belly up, right? They all went bankrupt. And that's why they all ended up getting torn out. But yes, to your point about racial segregation, did it influence our early streetcar network? Absolutely. Because you could not buy a home in one of these communities if you were not white. So our early streetcar network was very much a transportation system for white folks, not exclusively, but very much, because it was being used by people who were going from jobs in the job center in LA, in downtown particularly, out to these communities further out that the streetcars were designed to get them to and from. So in terms of the streetcar network, yes. Now, where that comes into play today is that a lot of the light rail network that's being constructed by Metro today is being built on existing right-of-way that was streetcar right-of-way. So the blue or A line that goes between downtown LA and downtown Long Beach is on an old streetcar line. The Expo line between Santa Monica and downtown LA is on an old rail line. The Gold line that's being extended further out from Azusa out toward San Bernardino County is on old light rail line, old streetcar line. So these old rights of way are functioning now as part of the backbone for the light rail network. Now, as far as our bus public transit, that's a different story. And I frankly think that would make a fascinating thesis, but I don't feel like I can really comment at this point as far as the shape of our current public transit network as far as how it's impacted by racial segregation of 60, 50 years ago.
Thanks, Luke. Our next question is from Chuck, and he says, excellent presentation. Thanks, Chuck. I'll thank you on behalf of Luke. And he asks, how has being in an area with major seismic activity complicated LA housing issues?
Interesting question. So I think I would just challenge this a little bit, because I grew up in the Midwest. And I remember thinking how ridiculous it was that we were building so much housing in Florida, where it was obviously going to be all underwater in 30 or 40 years, and they were getting hit by hurricanes every other year, or on the Gulf Coast where they get hit by hurricanes. And of course, people looked at us and thought we were ridiculous for living in an area where we would get these massive snowstorms or these horrible tornadoes. I think it's important to recognize that there are natural challenges in any region. Now, as far as the seismic challenges for LA, that's actually something that poses us a bit of a challenge for our dingbats, for that naturally occurring affordable housing that we built in that 10-year span, because so many of them are constructed on stilts that we saw and I forget the name of this. I forget the name of the Northridge quake in 1991, where a lot of dingbat structures in the valley collapsed because they're not well constructed to withstand earthquakes. The question around earthquake and sort of the impacts that has on our house, encourage you to think about that, but I also encourage you to think about how every region has its challenges. And frankly, we don't have to deal with snowstorms here or with hurricanes here. We actually have, in terms of climate, one of the best possible climates for building relatively affordable housing, because we don't have to gird it against every climate of the country. So there are reasons that our earthquakes present a really unique and interesting challenge, and there's also reasons that in other ways we're a much more attractive area to build housing that might make it naturally more affordable.
Thanks, Luke.
We got time for one or two more questions.
We've got one more question from Ryan. His question is, in terms of simplifying zoning and thus making housing production easier, when is Recode LA expected to be finalized?
Oh boy, I wish I knew. As far as I know, Recode LA has been happening for well over a decade, and in that time has been significantly minimized in terms of the potential impact that it will have. And again, we talk about sort of regional housing needs. Recode LA is just specific to the city of LA. It had very sort of grand hopes and promises that it came up with when it first started. And as far as I know, all of those things have basically been whittled away to not a whole lot left. We'll see. As far as I'm concerned, one of the most significant things we could do would be similar to what they've done in Oregon or in Minneapolis, where you can now build a quadplex or a fourplex anywhere that's zoned single family. So you can actually, you could even convert a single family home to being 2 or 3 individual apartments, which you cannot do in single family zoning in LA today. There are some allowances now in state law that exist to go up to 3 units on a property that's zoned single family, but there are still challenges to getting to that. I think if we made it simple and it just made an administrative, like check a few boxes, that would be one of the significant things we could do to address our housing affordability crisis, to allow people to subdivide homes in a very simple, easy, cheap fashion, without putting a bunch of additional burden on them to construct new garages and parking, or to, whatever the case may be, that we add all these administrative, these not administrative, but these additional code issues that they encounter. We just made it as simple as, oh, you want to make it 4 units? Go for it. And all we have to do is sign off on the architectural plans. That would be one of the easiest ways we can get to a great deal more housing and more affordable housing in LA in a very short span of time.
Thanks, Luke. That's our last question for today. So I'll
Excellent.
let you.
Well, I want to thank all of you for spending your Sunday afternoon with us here. It is my pleasure to do this, and I certainly encourage you all to ask questions as you have them afterward. I'm going to share my contact information with you one more time so you have it. So if you want to send me an email, that's my Twitter handle, Luke H. Clip, or you can find me at Facebook, although I don't tend to check it as much these days. So I'm happy to be available to answer any questions, to make any references to additional materials that might help you in this, and just really appreciate your interest in these issues and welcome your engagement and future involvement. So thank you.